Ready? All right. I'm assuming we're on. This is the introduction to our topic of science in the Bible. And we're looking at answering the questions. So these are God's insights into the sciences. Often we hear about science in the Bible and how the Bible is inaccurate. Especially skeptics will say, well, this couldn't have been what was being talked about. But the point of the questions, especially in Job 38, 39, and 40, was that Job didn't have the answers. So it's not that, oh, Job was too early, he couldn't have known these things. It was God knew these things already. And so as we go through the different topics, these are things that God revealed to Job that Job may or may not have been able to understand. But as science has caught up to what God said, we find it's awfully surprising how insightful it was. And as Christians, we should not be surprised. The goal of this is to help all of us understand how science is presented in the Bible and to help people who don't believe that God is real or that the Bible is true see how science confirms what is in the Bible rather than disputing it. And so I'm just going to go over the topics that we're going to cover for the next couple weeks and give you a short teaser of what kinds of things we're going to talk about. So the first topic in Job is astronomy. Job 38, 31 through 32 says, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season, or can you guide the great bear with its cubs? And I've got a cool graphic up there because only relatively recently have we discovered that the Pleiades, unlike most constellations in the night sky, are actually bound together and they are a group. It's not just the seven sisters. There's about 250 stars in that cluster, and they're all moving together. And so that's one of the topics we'll cover in astronomy. Then we'll cover geoscience. Job 38, 4 and 6 say, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? And I've got a little graphic up here that shows some ancients' understanding of the world. And this is actually what a lot of skeptics think Job would have been describing if it was Job talking about these things. But when we get to earth sciences or geoscience, we'll talk about what Job's understanding might have been and how it doesn't matter what Job understood, because this was God asking Job, were you there? And he's not just asking Job, he's asking skeptics, he's asking scientists, he's asking us, were you there? Because the only eyewitness account of the creation of the world comes from Genesis chapter 1, and it has to be from God, not from man. And then we'll cover oceanography. Job 38, 8 and 10, or who shut in the sea with its doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors. And it's a fun picture. This is actually the meeting of two seas. It's the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, who have different salinity and density, and so they don't mix immediately when they hit. They actually hit, and there's a line, and there's a whole bunch of people who've taken pictures of this. It's a really cool phenomenon. But we'll cover more than just the borders of the ocean when we get there. Zoology. Job 39, 26 and 27. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? And so we're going to look at a whole bunch of animals, their behavior, and a lot of the animals' behavior had not been observed by lots of people up to that point. And so some of these things, scientists will say, oh, that's not how animals behave. And then you look at more modern accounts, look at what we study now with all of our conservation efforts, and we discover that a lot of these behaviors are truly what the animals do. It's just our misunderstanding of what was said that causes us to, or causes skeptics to say, oh, that's not how animals behave. Oh, no, that's how these animals behave. That's how God observed them. Because the point is, once again, this is not stuff that we do. We can't help birds fly south. We don't tell eagles to have nests up high. Instead, it's God who created the animals, gave them the instincts, gave them the abilities to do what they do. So we'll cover all that. And then cryptozoology. This one I'm really looking forward to. Oh, yes, the graphic is not as high definition as I would have liked. But it's just a fun picture because it's got a sauropod next to a hippopotamus and an elephant, because we talk about the behemoth, and its tail moves like a cedar doesn't describe a hippopotamus or an elephant. And yes, those are big land animals, but behemoth was bigger than that. And so cryptozoology will look at behemoth, we'll look at leviathan, and we'll look at how Job, being early on in history, may have seen a lot more of the what we call dinosaurs than what modern science thinks man ever could have observed. So cryptozoology is something I'm really looking forward to covering with you guys. Then we'll cover climatology. Job 38:22. Have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail? And one of the things that's interesting about climatology is in Job, there's all sorts of details about winds and wind patterns and snow and rain and even the water cycle that science didn't catch up to for another 1,000, 2,000 years. And so all these things Job did not know. And once again, the whole point is, these are things that man didn't know. These are things that God created and instituted. And so God is asking Job, is this by your doing? Are you wise enough? Have you observed this? And Job didn't answer these questions. All right, after climatology, we'll look at flood evidence. Job 22:15-16 says, will you keep to the old way, which wicked men have trod, who were cut down before their time, whose foundations were swept away by a flood? And a lot of skeptics, I've been reading a lot of our commentaries and a lot of other side, and a lot of skeptics are like, well, Job might have observed a small flood here or there. Well, Job didn't live through the flood. He didn't. But Shem was still alive when Job was alive. How do I know that? Well, Shem was still alive when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob died, and Shem was still alive. So Job could have talked to some of the flood survivors and found out what was going on, what happened before. And there are lots of little indications in the book of Job that the flood was relatively recent in Job's history. So we'll look at those details and the evidence in the book of Job. And then we'll wrap it up with what actually drew my attention to the book of Job for science: Ice Age markers. Job is the first account written. It was written before Moses wrote the book of Genesis, because Job lived about the same time as the patriarchs. Abraham probably was in the same time frame. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But there are so many references to snow and ice and frost and melts and rivers and floods that could have come from an ice age, that could have been evidence that showed that Job was still living in the after effects of the flood. And as a creationist who believes in the short, young earth and short creation and the truth of the Bible, the evidence of all this ice coming after the flood makes perfect sense, makes it very logical. And so we see all these words. Job uses more words for frozen water than any other book of the Bible. And it makes sense if he was living at the end of the Ice Age. So we'll cover that. I don't think I read this verse. From whose womb comes the ice And the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. That's Job 38:29 through 30. And so that'll wrap up our study in Job and sciences. The whole point of this is that God spends a lot of time asking Job questions to which he did not have the answers, some of which we still do not have answers for, but more understanding of what God was talking about in Job. And I want to assert with this series that God's understanding of nature and science is shown through his conversation with Job, that modern science backs up the truths pointed to in all of God's word. And I want to equip us each to be clear how the Bible points to God as the author of science. So I'm looking forward to sharing these topics with you, and we'll continue this soon.